Dan, were you destined to be a lawyer?
Well, from the ninth grade on, yes, I decided that's what I wanted to do.
And was your dad a lawyer?
No, no. I had an uncle who was a lawyer, and I had a great-grandfather who'd been a lawyer, but there wasn't a lot of lawyering in my family.
Mm-hmm. And schooling-wise, you grew up in Alabama, right?
Right.
And whereabouts?
Well, I was born in Selma, and I grew up there and in another nearby town named Greenville, both of them near Montgomery.
And as far as from your formal education?
Well, I went through the public schools of Selma and Greenville, and I did a year at the Citadel in Charleston. And then for various reasons, I left there and transferred to Auburn University, where I did the rest of my undergraduate work, and then went to the University of Alabama Law School, graduated there, and then later I did a year of graduate work at the Harvard Law School.
So how do you reconcile Auburn, Alabama football games?
Well, I don't. I just don't get into it. When I attended the games at each one when I was there, but since then I take a rather neutral, disinterested posture.
Then ultimately you find your way into working as Hugo Black's law clerk. How did that happen?
Well, I had that aspiration all the time I was in law school because there were two clerks ahead of me who came from Selma, Alabama. And I knew that they had been there with Black. I knew that early on, before I ever got to law school, that they had been law clerks for Black. That's how I learned about the whole institution of law clerking, was because of those two men, Marks Lever and Truman Hobbs, who had been Black's clerks. And so that was in my mind the whole time. And between my second and third year in law school, during the summer, I went to Washington and had an interview with Black. It was lined up for me by Senator Lister Hill from Alabama. He and Black were very good friends. And but I was just then starting my third year of law school. And then what happened is the Korean War came along, and I went into the Army and was gone for 2 years in the Army. And I sort of kept contact with Black. I let him know what was going on. I didn't want to lose contact with him, that I was off in the Army, and I would like to reapply when I came back. And meantime, he wrote me and said that he had adopted the practice of taking clerks who had already clerked for a year for a U.S. Circuit judge. So that threw kind of a whole new thing into the picture that I figured I was going to have to get back and find a position as a clerk for a circuit judge. But then I got the inspiration I wanted to get back and do more law study. I was always sort of academically oriented. I was a little uncertain whether I wanted to practice or teach way back in there. So I decided after the Army it would be good to get a real refresher and get back into the law by doing a year of graduate study at the Harvard Law School. So I wrote Justice Black and said, would a year of graduate study at Harvard do in place of a clerkship for a circuit judge? And he wrote back and said yes. So I reapplied, and when I got to Harvard, I wrote him and told him I'm here now, you know. So that's how it all came about.
So you came in during the summer of '54.
Correct.
And Brown versus Board 1 had already been decided.
Correct.
And was there a buzz going on because of the next phase, the Brown versus?
You mean a buzz on the court when I got there?
Yeah. Was there any discussion at all, or was it over in that sense? Dan, I want to introduce, this is Professor John Barrett.
Oh, hello.
Professor Meador, good to meet you.
Glad to see you.
How was your trip up here?
Fine, thank you. I seem to be on the witness stand now.
You do.
Right.
This is direct. It's friendly questioning.
I see. Right. Right.
I'm just going to sit in and listen. So carry on wherever you guys are.
All right.
What we were talking about his arrival after concluding Harvard, and that this was in the summer of 1954.
Okay.
Post Brown versus Board 1, and whether or not there was even conversation about what just had occurred on May 17th, 1954.
I arrived the 1st of August. I do not recall any conversation about it among the clerks or with anybody. There may have been a little comment here, there, yonder, but I do not recall it. Certainly there was no serious, extended conversation among the clerks. We ate lunch every day together in the clerks' dining room there on the ground floor of the Supreme Court building. There were 18 of us total that year on the court. I just don't recall any Brown discussion among that group, and certainly there wasn't any with Black at all. Hadn't been the year before either with his clerks. Total silence. The case might well not have existed, as far I put it that way.
So when were you kind of asked to kind of kick in with Justice Black, even thinking about the implementation component of Brown?
Well, there was no discussion at all with Black, no. None. As I say, the case might as well not have existed,
Right.
As far as any discussion with Justice Black or among the clerks,
Right.
for that matter. We got down, the next event about it came in April when the arguments took place. You know, they were scheduled for December, but because of Jackson's death, they were put over until his replacement could arrive. And Holland was confirmed, as I recall, about mid-March, and the arguments took place around the middle of April. As I recall, there were about 3 days of arguments. And that's the first time I really encountered the Brown case. I sat in on all the arguments. And heard them in the courtroom. But again, no discussion with Black about it. I mean, he knew I was sitting in on the arguments, but there was no discussion about it. And the next thing I know, the opinion comes down at the end of May. And after that, there was a little discussion about it with Black. I remember one thing. Immediately after the opinion was I was in the courtroom when the opinion was handed down. And I went back around to his chambers, and he was there shortly. And I had noticed one thing, which I later went back and verified in the written opinion was correct, that in the opinion, Warren uses the term discrimination numerous times, maybe 6 or 7 times, just talk about discrimination or racial discrimination, et cetera, et cetera. And I said to Black, I noticed he used the term discrimination many times, and never did he use the word segregation or desegregation. And I was a little curious about that. So I said this to Black. He just smiled and said, well, I think they'll understand what we mean. They was a big word with Black. They was the rest of the world out there who, in his view, would avidly read these opinions and think about them.
Very idealistic.
He used to say, we need to write them so they'll understand it. Okay. They was this big word with him. They meaning, I could see him reading at truck stops, and all that kind of thing in his mind.
Did you have any sense that he was getting Alabama heat as these cases were in the court over those few years?
No, there was...
or feedback?
There were letters coming in.
Okay.
Letters coming in, most of them very hostile and critical.
Right.
I remember one I distinctly remember, not so much about Black, but I happen to remember this one. About a month after Jackson died, there came a postcard one day that said, 1 down, 8 to go, you can't win with the Lord at the wheel. But there were a lot of hostile letters, which, we saw most of them, the clerks did. They didn't really, most of them were just rather emotional and hostile.
Right.
Not a whole lot of substance that I recall about them.
What about your own background and your circle of friends and family in Alabama?
Well, yeah, it wasn't much of that either. Personally, on me, Black had warned me. When I went down to interview for the clerkship, I was at the Harvard Law School that year, and I got this letter from Black along about February, who says kind of a non-committally, if you're interested, I'd be glad to talk to you at some point. Well, I took that to mean, if I'm interested in this clerkship, I better go. And I was right. I got there, and when I sat down with him, almost the first thing he said is, before you came down here today, I'd already decided to take you. Well, I think if I'd not gone,
right,
I wouldn't have gotten it. That's my interpretation of that. So I went. In that conversation, he told me, he said, this was before Brown won, about, 2 months, 3 months before that. He said, there are going to be some very contentious, controversial race cases coming along here. And there's going to be a lot of backlash and so on. He said, I don't know whether you really would be wise to take this position if you plan to go back to Alabama. And my recollection of what I said is, well, you know, I'll just take my chances on that. And so, I mean, I was well aware of that. He didn't have to tell me. But there wasn't, I don't recall any personal problems with it at all myself back in Alabama. There may have been talk about it, but I never got any feeling of hostility or reaction on me.
Now, some of the other law clerks were involved in these research projects over that summer of 1954 and were involved in writing a memo that was printed and circulated to the justices. At some point, did you get wind of that, or that was all in a...
No, I did not. And I've talked to the two clerks for the year before me, who were David Vann and Charlie Reich, best known for the Greening of America.
Right.
They have exactly the same thing, I would say. They never heard it discussed. They never saw a piece of paper relating to it. Nothing. As I say, it's as though the case did not exist as far as the clerks in Black's chambers were concerned. The same carried on with me. I never saw a memo, never heard of anything at all.
And in the clerks' lunches and so forth, over the year, they never...
I do not recall it.
Gunther was very involved.
Yeah.
Davidson, Prettyman, obviously. We're going to hear a bit about that.
They are the only, Earl Pollock, to my knowledge, they may have been the only clerks who had much to do with it all. I know some of the other clerks. The one I knew best was one of Burton's clerks, because he and I were only, there were 3 unmarried clerks that year out of 18. And he was one of them, I was one of them, so we saw much more of each other than I did with any other clerk, because we were not married. And he never heard of anything in Burton's office. It had nothing to do with it at all. So I think that may have been more characteristic of most of the clerks. I think Prettyman, Pollock, Davidson were unique, probably, although I haven't checked it out with all 18.
Right, right. Who was the Burton clerk? Who was your friend?
Tom O'Neill. He's now a federal district judge in Philadelphia. Right.
Being from Selma, Alabama, and being the dean of Alabama Law School in the 60s.
Right.
And obviously a lot of activity occurred in that. That was sort of the epicenter
Right.
of activity. And given the fact that you had just kind of seen the judicial side of it through Brown versus Board 2, how did that play out? How did you react to all that? You saw the civil rights activities and...
Well, I was at the University of Virginia Law School when all that, most of the turmoil was going on in Alabama. I was not there. I went to the law school in Alabama in the summer of '66, when most of all of that was over and behind us, more or less. So I was at a distance. I wasn't there around it. It was going on, and I was, heavily involved in my own work in the law school, so I really didn't get caught up in all that in Alabama. I got to the law school, and there wasn't, things I think had reached a kind of a quiet period. That was my perception when I arrived on the scene. And one of the things that showed a big difference is, it was during my time in the law school, I was there 4 years as dean, that Justice Black was resurrected in Alabama. He had been persona non grata, absolutely, up until about then. And I sort of helped that effort along. They invited him to the annual meeting of the Alabama State Bar. I think it was in the summer of '67. I'd been there about a year. And I set up, and the meeting was in Tuscaloosa where the law school is. And so I set up a big law school event in connection with that, alumni gathering and so on, a huge kind of luncheon and so on, where he spoke and all that in the law school. And that was his re-entry into the state. And it went over very, very well. And about 2 years later, about a year after Warren Burger had been appointed Chief Justice, he and Black came together to a meeting of the Alabama State Bar in Birmingham. And that was a big deal. Huge attendance at that meeting where they both appeared and spoke. And it was clear then that Black had been re-accepted into Alabama during my time there as dean. And I sort of pride myself in having had a little part in bringing that about.
Was that just a function of the passage of time, or?
To a great extent, I think.
Okay. Black perhaps had begun a little bit of a conservative turn in those last few terms on the court?
Yeah, that may have a little bit to do with it. I think, though, largely it was a passage of time. More so than anything else, I believe.
Okay.
That'd be my recollection about that.
Dan, coming in August of '54 and reflecting maybe a little bit on the personalities of the justices,
Right.
Had you been studying, had you been talking to other clerks about some of the other justices around the court with specific attention to Robert Jackson? What did he mean to you?
Well, Jackson, I arrived there, as I say, in August. I saw Jackson only once. I remember I was in my office there with the door open onto the corridor, and here comes Jackson walking along the corridor, heading toward the conference room. And he was just walking slowly along by himself, and there he was. I saw him. He was in view maybe 10 or 15 seconds or so, and that was the only time I ever saw Jackson. He was dead within another week or 10 days after that. And the clerks, we all went in a body to his funeral in National Cathedral. My recollection is we sat as a group in the balcony of the north transept of National Cathedral for the funeral service. And then, of course, the entire court went to Jamestown. Right. So Black was gone after that for 2 or 3 days.
Any recollection of Black's commenting on the trip to Jamestown?
No, I've thought about that a lot. No, in fact, looking back on it, I recall Black maybe mentioning Jackson once or twice, just sort of in passing, saying Bob Jackson, maybe referring to some case or some opinion they had. Bob Jackson said this or that, just sort of in passing. But I recall no real discussion with Black about Jackson.
Even at the immediate moment of Jackson's death?
Yeah, I just don't. I don't. It's sort of strange in a way looking back on it, but I do not recall that.
They had had their famous
right. My impression
difficulties
is,
10 years earlier.
My impression about that, I sort of picked up by little drips and drabs, sort of, is that the hard feelings out of that seem to have diminished to me a lot. One day, Jackson was in Black's office one day when I was in the room next door. I didn't see him and didn't hear it, of course, but the secretary said Justice Jackson is in there and so on, and because I didn't go in. But she had some comments. She seemed to think that they were getting along quite well, and sort of his general attitude about it when they did mention his name maybe a couple of times. So my impression was that the worst of that was sort of behind them, that there weren't any real hard, bitter feelings continuing.
Right, right. Now, that secretary when you were a law clerk was Elizabeth?
No, Gladys Coates.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. He was he already married to Elizabeth?
No. She came later.
She came later.
He didn't even know her at that moment.
Okay.
Yeah, he was between wives when I was there.
Okay. And wasn't he battling shingles?
He had shingles off and on. What I can't remember, though, about those shingles, I don't distinctly remember that so much during my term. You know, these things we're talking 50 years ago. It's a little hard to...
Right.
I know he had some shingles problems, but what I'm not clear whether that came a little later. I just don't recall much about shingles when I was there.
He'd had a real serious case a year earlier.
Maybe
at the
so,
end
yeah.
of the 52 term.
But he was very active when I was there. He played tennis all the time. He had no medical problems that I could see at all when I was there.
Okay.
When you were there, Justice Black had the closest relationship with whom?
Oh, probably Douglas, although that wasn't, that was a little strained, I thought. He highly disapproved of Douglas's private life. You could tell he didn't like that. And they weren't that close, I don't think. Ideologically, sort of speaking, I think they've always been kind of linked, and they were together on a lot of opinions and one thing and another. But I recall hearing Douglas maybe being in Black's office a couple of times during the year, but there was not a lot of back and forth thing. I had a feeling that their relationship was a little distant and cool, certainly not warm personally, as far as I could tell.
What about Frankfurt?
Well, Frankfurt and Black always seemed to be in a contentious posture in relation to each other. and they had such different views about various things. And Black would, I remember one day, we had, as I mentioned, the clerks had this private dining room downstairs, and one of the things we did, we would have speakers in from time to join us from lunch. In the course of the year, every justice came to lunch once with the group of clerks. We had other people too around town, like Dean Atchison, Eric Severide, and the Solicitor General and others. It was quite an interesting little addition to our lunches. Anyway, the day Frankfurter came to lunch, it was the longest lunch by odd we ever had. It lasted about 3 hours. And what he did is, he said, as the lunch was winding down, I would go around the table and have each one of you ask me a question, and then I'll answer them. So we go around the table. He got 18 questions. All right. Then he started over, and miraculously he answered each one of them. He addressed each question. And this went on, as I say, for about 3 hours. So he finally got back up to the chambers, and the first thing Black said, well, is school over? He often make comment. He says, Felix says he has to struggle very hard to disguise his bias in favor of labor. And he says he's very successful at it because I never detected any.
What about Black and Chief Justice Warren?
Very close and warm, I would say. He was a great admirer of Warren, I believe. Yes, I think he thought very well of Warren. He did.
Did you get a sense that when Chief Justice Warren first came on the court, there was a kind of a tugging and pulling for his attention, and that folks like Frankfurter and Black were sort of competing for that?
Well, I have a sense that Frankfurter certainly was, to try to co-opt him and to be sure that Warren got on the right track and the right gospel, etc. I never had any feeling that Black, I don't think Black was that type. Black was kind of content in his own world. He didn't do a lot of proselytizing or, missionary work of any sort. I think he was, Warren would come to see him from time to time. That was not infrequent, I would say, for have Warren popping in. But I didn't get any sense that Black was out crusading in the way that Frankfurter, I think, did.
Who was your mentor as you were going on to the court? I know clerks tend to have other clerks give you some direction.
No, I would say none. Well, Prettyman had been there the year before, and so had Pollock. They were the kind of seniors of the group. They were viewed as kind of the head of the thing, titular head of the clerks group, because they had been there a year before. And that was very helpful to have them there. In fact, I think it was Barrett Prettyman largely who lined up these speakers that came in for lunch from time to time. But there was no particular mentoring. I don't recall any sort of going to them to get much instruction and so on and so on. There may have been a little of that here and there, but not much.
Was there someone at Harvard who was a particular sponsor or a teacher who put in the vouch for you? Well,
the one I knew best, and I guess my favorite one there, was Paul Freund. I took his seminar, the year-long seminar in constitutional litigation. So he is the only one I really knew there personally. I did get to know him in that seminar, which was only about 12 students maybe. The rest of the work was in large classes, and I didn't really get to know any of the other professors personally. But so Freund did write a letter to Black. Black inquired of him along the way. I found out later. I don't know what Freund said, but it obviously didn't hurt. I was a great admirer of Freund. I liked his seminar very much.
And did they have much of a personal relationship, Black and Freund?
No, I don't think so. No.
During that 1954 term that you were there, what was the highlight?
Well, the big dramatic highlights, of course, were the death of Jackson and then the coming on of Harlan. They were the two big events. The year itself was a pretty placid year, I would say, in the court. There were no real blockbuster decisions at all. A rather mundane array of cases, it seemed to me. The most interesting one to me was one not decided that term, and that was Toth against Talbot. I worked a lot on that case. It was argued during that year, and we worked on it a lot. That had to do with the constitutionality of trying by court-martial a discharged serviceman. He'd been in Korea and was home and discharged, and then was rearrested by the Army, so to speak, or arrested by the Army and brought to trial before a court-martial. And the question was, could a discharged veteran, totally out of the Army, be tried by court-martial for an offense committed while he was in active service? And Black was writing this opinion in the case, holding it to be unconstitutional for a reason the briefs had not really recognized, but Black originated his ground. Most of the argument focused on whether the Fifth Amendment prevented this. Black's approach was that Article 1 didn't authorize it. He didn't even get to the Bill of Rights. It was simply not authorized by Article 1 of the Constitution. And Reed was writing another opinion. I forget exactly what Reed's opinion said now, but he was working on the case. I think the case may actually have been assigned to Reed. I'm not sure about that. But the long and short of it is, they decided to set it down for re-argument after Harlan came on board. And they did. They re-argued it and decided the next year. And Black's opinion turned out to be the majority opinion for the court. But that, to me, was the most interesting case, and particularly since I've been trying court-martial cases in Korea. So Black said, I want your particular interest focused on this case. And I did a lot of work on it and enjoyed that a lot. To me, that was the most interesting case of the term. The rest of them were in fields that did not excite me particularly.
And what's the name of that case again?
Toth against Talbot. Well, actually, it was Toth against Qualls at one time changed its name. Secretary of the Air Force changed. I think it ended up as Toth against Talbot. Toth, anyway, was the petition of the first name. Mm.
Since we've talked a few times, Dan, and you're coming up here to talk a little bit about Brown versus Board, do you get a sense as to what the legacy is of Brown versus Board 1 and 2, especially as you think about it from an Alabama perspective?
The legacy of it? You mean the results or the long-range consequences, or what do you mean?
Consequences, yeah.
Well, obviously in the long run it resulted in the desegregation of the schools, which took a long time, I would say Brown didn't really have a significant impact in Alabama for about 10 years, I would say. Well, as I say, I was not there, but that's my impression. And then what really, I think, gave it an impact were actions by Congress, the various civil rights bills and so on. That's what I think, Voting Rights Act, all of that kind of got desegregation going in Alabama in a big way that had not been the case for several years. Mm-hmm. So it was a long kind of period there that not a lot was happening. As I say, I was not there, so I can't tell you firsthand about it all, but that was my impression.
Did you have a sense then, or in hindsight, do you have a sense that the court got it right or should have taken other paths dealing with Brown?
Yeah, I've sort of gone back and forth in my mind about that. It's a very difficult question. Well, one thing I'm sure about, given Brown won, I think what they did in Brown 2 was right. That I have no question about that. Black said, and I mentioned a moment ago, there were a few comments about the case after it was over. Black told me, I've heard him say a couple of things about it. One was that his greatest apprehension about the result of this case was that judges all over the South would be entering injunctions, and they'd be bringing people up, school board members and others up, to hold them in contempt and trying without jury. He believed, contrary to what the existing law is, that in a criminal contempt charge, a person had a right to trial by jury. And he foresaw that there might be a lot of that going on, violating what he considered a right to trial by jury. Now, all that didn't happen, I don't think, but he told me that was his main apprehension about it, that it would.
That's very interesting. So he saw it as an incorporation controversy almost.
Yeah, well,
non-incorporation.
A potential out there, yeah. He also had said that, and this was a conversation I had with him 2 or 3 years later, not at the time. Looking back, he thought that they should have entered an immediate decree that the plaintiffs, the parties to the cases, be admitted to school on a non-segregated basis, that they should have ordered immediate admission on a non-segregated basis. He thought it was a mistake not to have done that.
Boy, Dan, I could go on for a long time, but it's 4 o'clock.
Yeah, I would like a chance to change if I can.
Well, as promised, our good bellman is here.
Oh, good.
Let me take
All right. Yes, I forget I'm all wired up here. Right.
And we're
Okay.
going to see you around 4:45 or so.
All right.
But take your time because there's.
I'll come back to the lobby then.
That's right.
To meet you there.
Correct.
All right.
Come over here.
Good to see you here.
Great to
John,
great
good
to have you here.
All right. Okay, where's my bellman? Is he?
You come right up.
Okay.
And he'll just take your hand.
Yeah. Fine.
Okay, this is Chris.
All right. Good. Okay.
Professor Meador.
Thank you.
Okay.
I'll see
We'll
you later.
in a bit, Dan.
Okay.
How are you, sir? What room are you going to?
174, I think was.